Hey everyone, it's Jeff Sheldon. Back in April, we recorded an interview with Matt Brown, the founder and publisher of Extra Points, which is a newsletter and website where Matt covers the business of college sports and does it incredibly well. We released that interview as part of a bonus episode that was exclusive for Volleyball State Patreon subscribers back in April. Matt's one of the best journalists around to cover the financial aspects of college sports, and we talked to him leading up to the finalization of the NCAA House settlement. We talked about how that could affect Olympic sports like volleyball and the tough decisions that were coming to athletic departments across the country. Now, since that conversation in April, a number of things have happened. The NCAA House settlement was finally finalized in June, and that set the dollar limits that schools can share with players and revenue sharing. But as we've seen since then, the story is far from over, and it might not be over for a long time if something like this is ever truly settled. There's been a lawsuit filed by a number of former student athletes saying that the House settlement violates Title IX because it's inevitably going to lead to female student athletes being paid less than men. The settlement also didn't immediately put to an end the wild, wild west of NIL payments as schools raced to front load their agreements with high dollar amounts, most notably at Texas Tech, to beat the House settlement going into effect. And attorneys involved in the House case are already fighting about whether the newly created College Sports Commission even has the authority to reject deals for student athletes put together by NIL collectives. And just last week, a bill was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives called the SCORE Act, which would put a lot of these regulations into law. Although the country has a few other things going on right now, if you haven't noticed, it's not at all clear how big of a priority this would be in either the House or even the United States Senate. So in short, everything is still a gigantic mess, just like it was back in April when we talked to Matt. Lincoln and I talked the other day, and we decided that this interview with Matt Brown would be a good thing to release for free to all Volleyball State subscribers or Volleyball State listeners, which is why you're hearing it right now. We're not going to do this with all of our bonus content. We'd still be grateful for you supporting our show for just $5 a month at patreon.com/i80club, where you're going to get bonus pods like this one, newsletters, access to live shows, and even more. But stuff like this conversation with Matt is going to make you a more knowledgeable volleyball fan, which is one of our big goals with the show. And we'd also encourage you to check out Matt's ongoing reporting on this issue at extrapointsmb.com, where you can subscribe to Matt's newsletter. He's also really well sourced on conference realignment issues, and he was very kind to spend some time with us. So here is our interview from April with Matt Brown of Extra Points. Debut, Matt Brown, the founder and publisher of Extra Points. Matt, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your time today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. Well, we knew that you were going to know as much as anyone about the business side of college sports, especially when it comes to the House settlement that has been on all the headlines this week. But for our listeners who maybe just be getting introduced to you, you used to be an elementary school teacher. You've got a college football reporting background with SB Nation. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you kind of evolved to cover sports business and everything else that Extra Points covers.
Sure. I definitely fell into sports media through the back door, right? And not a traditional path. I don't have a journalism degree. I studied something different in college, and you're right, did elementary school teaching, did some kind of corporate HR gigs, some organizing work, which I actually think is all really useful for being a reporter, in part because teaching fourth grade will give you a lot of experience in trying to take complicated topics and make them more approachable. It's also very important in talking to people that do not want to talk to you. I've joked about this. Like, there's nothing any AD is ever going to say to me that I haven't heard from my students in far more colorful language, right? Like, or doing some other kind of door knocking work in my world. It's good preparation for building thick skin, and it also exposed me. And this was also true of just coming from like an educator family, but of the kind of places that produce a lot of college athletes. And I think once you get to understand how a lot of K-12 schools work, I think you become a little more curious about how athletics is interconnected with higher education generally. And it changes how I think you cover how athletes act or perform when they're in college. I think when you have a more 360 view of what their whole lives were like. At SB Nation, there was a lot of traditional sports coverage, but you also recognize that we were smaller. We didn't have rights like ESPN or Fox did. So if my whole job was calling Scott Frost or trying to call Urban Meyer or something, we're going to be at the very bottom of the callback list. But if you're writing about business or finance or policy, one, there's not as much competition. But then two, a lot of those people are going to want to call you back because they want to know that information too. So I've been really lucky after going independent in 2020. I started Extra Points full time during the pandemic when I got laid off, and I realized I got a wife and kids and a mortgage, and people are demanding I buy Lunchables, and you gotta make money to do that. But it's not like I could go get a newspaper job or anything because there's no sports. So going into business for myself and covering these things are really deeply interesting to me, which sometimes that's labor law, sometimes that's policy, business, finance, how athletic departments get and spend money from a major level like a Nebraska to a Nebraska Kearney, or I just got off the phone with some folks at the MIAA before hopping on this call. Have a real big picture view has allowed me to build relationships and understand how all of this stuff works across the industry, which I think is really gratifying, even if it means I might not know. I certainly won't know as much about volleyball as you guys do, but hopefully some of the things I know about money and about what's happening at the university president's office may be helpful for your audience.
Yeah. What grade were you teaching in elementary school?
I taught fourth grade.
Okay. Is that more similar to coaches or administrators or athletes? What do you relate to best as fourth grader?
That is a great question, and I think a major similarity that fourth graders and high-level coaches tend to have, and this is something I would say with love, is that both groups tend to be absolute control freaks. They want to control everything in their environment, and anything that's out of that control, especially if they see it that's something that their peers might have that you don't have, it's easy for them to freak out. And so for fourth graders, you have to spend a lot of time building a culture and letting them understand what they can control and what they can't, and how you sitting in table group blue and not green does not mean the heat death of the universe or everything. And there's a little bit of that in coaches too, because if somebody has a shiny new toy across the state, by God, that coach is going to feel like they need it, or else we're going to lose in recruiting, or everything's going to fall apart. And sometimes you need the principal or the AD or the parent or someone to put their arm around and say, this doesn't matter. Let's focus on the stuff that does matter. It's hard to tell that to a 10-year-old. Hard to tell that to somebody else whose ability to pay their own mortgage depends on beating Minnesota.
For sure. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that perspective. So we wanted to have you on this week because it's been a big transformational news week in college sports. The House settlement had their hearing on Monday, and it wasn't quite finalized. I think they got at least another week, if not a couple of weeks. But it seemed, from what the reports are, it seems pretty close to. Kind of big picture, what's at stake in that California courtroom?
Sure. A great question. I'll try to zoom out a little bit on the off chance that you're somebody who's not a sicko like I am and has been tracking this very, very closely. When we talk about House v. NCAA, this is a collection of 3 large antitrust cases that involve current and former college athletes who are suing over lost NIL opportunities, lost licensing opportunities through old video games, and the ability to earn NIL compensation through broadcast rights. And so as part of that, the NCAA and power conferences don't want to go to court. They'll probably lose. They have to pay treble damages. It's not an exaggeration. It would literally bankrupt the NCAA. We would be talking like multiple billions of dollars in damages. So there's a proposed settlement that would change things pretty significantly for how all major college sports operates, including volleyball. The settlement has not been formally approved yet. I agree. It's likely to happen with some minor adjustments in the next 2 weeks. But I would say that there are 3 big changes that volleyball fans would need to be aware of. One is that power conference schools like in Nebraska or Wisconsin or Texas, and anybody else that chooses to opt into this settlement will be liable for back damages for payments to athletes that miss these opportunities, which will mean they'll lose some of the money they might have gotten from NCAA tournament units or NCAA pounds. If you're Nebraska, it's not the end of the world. If you're Omaha, it sucks to lose that extra $200,000. That might sting a little bit more, but that's one component. The other component is that for the first time ever, schools will be able to directly pay their athletes by buying their NIL rights. I'm making air quotes here because this is pay for play. It's not really about marketability or NIL, but it will mean that schools that opt in can spend up to $20 million and change in direct payments across their entire athletic department. And schools will now have to figure out how much of that money should go to football players, or men's and women's basketball players, or potentially volleyball players, or other sports. I think Nebraska in particular is an interesting use case about how to distribute that money. There's a base formula that some schools are using, but they have the ability to deviate from that. And then smaller schools like a Creighton or an Omaha or anybody else can opt in and share probably less than that. Sometimes it's $2, $4, $5, $6 million, and we can talk about what that means as well. The last big change is about roster and scholarship limits. And previously, you would have some college sports that were headcount sports. So anybody that got a scholarship got a full scholarship. And then you would have people on scholarship, and you'd have walk-ons. You have a limit to the number of people on your roster. And for most sports, the number of people on your roster would be larger than the number of scholarships you can give, right? I think for swimming, it might be it's like 9.2 or something that you used to be able to offer for soccer. And now, if you're opting into the settlement, which every power conference school is, and most mid-majors, you don't have that anymore. Now you can give people full scholarships if you want. You can break them up if you want, but the roster limit is the number of scholarships that you have. And that means that rosters are getting smaller. So in volleyball, that may mean that some schools will be able to offer more scholarship awards. It may mean that a lot of walk-ons are going to lose their spots and may have to transfer down or retire or move to Division II. And for other sports where traditionally the roster was much larger than the number of people on scholarship, like softball, the recruiting change could be massive. You might have a school that might double the amount of scholarships that they can offer, which really changes the math. So long way of saying here, there's more money coming into the sport, and the foundations of how recruiting and roster management work are going to look different. And they'll look more different for football and basketball, but it will look different for volleyball and lacrosse and softball as well.
And we do want to ask some questions that get to, how this might affect volleyball specifically, but also sports like baseball, wrestling, sports that have not earned a lot of revenue, or at least proportionate to football or men's basketball. But the number that everyone has kind of been kicking around as far as the pool of money that each school will have to pay student athletes, the revenue sharing total, it starts at $20.5 million as proposed by the settlement, and then it increases over time. Can you tell us how exactly they arrived at that number for the starting point to be spread across all of the sports?
I can, and I'll say this, not necessarily endorsing this formula, but here's where it comes from. So the schools that were the named defendants in this lawsuit were just the power conference institutions. Typically, in professional sports, when you have a collective bargaining agreement or revenue that's being shared, it's close to 50-50, the money that the league generates between owners and players. Now, in college sports, the plaintiffs and the lawyers for everybody else got together and said that wouldn't really make sense, because in college sports, you're also spending money on scholarships and health insurance and medical support and academic support and a bunch of other benefits. So they subtracted all the money that's spent on that other stuff, and then looked at the spending across all the A4 schools and came up with like 20.4 as the median. And you could split that up however you want to do it. This might seem pedantic, but it's not technically revenue sharing. If schools were allowed to share a percentage of their revenue, presumably Nebraska would be able to share more than 20% with their athletes, and Creighton less. And you're going to have some schools that barely make any revenue and will be sharing money. And that money might come from student fees or institutional support or something else. But that's where that money comes from. I think it's useful to think of that as the salary cap. But athletes can make money above that salary cap if they're actual marketing deals. And whether the NCAA or Deloitte or this third-party clearinghouse connection forced any of those rules, nobody knows. We know what they're going to try. We don't know what's going to stand up in court. But that does mean that if, like, the libero and a player in state does a deal with Runza and gets $20,000, that won't count against the cap. That's Runza money. That's not Nebraska's money.
Yeah, Becky Parrott, if you're listening, I'm sure you've got all the student athletes on speed dial. I'm glad you brought that up, Matt, because I have been on record on this show a lot being incredibly skeptical of the clearinghouse's enforceability. I don't know too many institutions that you bring Deloitte in and it makes it materially better. Apologies to any of our listeners or subscribers who work for Deloitte. But, this is supposed to make NIL as it's existed over the last couple of years go away and sort of bring order to chaos of the college landscape. Do you think that that's actually going to happen, or is NIL still going to kind of continue to be the wild, wild west, and Texas Tech oil boosters are still going to throw millions and millions of dollars into recruiting?
I think my terrible sports radio answer is going to be both. On one hand, will this bring complete order? I don't think we've had complete order since like the third day of creation, right? Like it's been chaos all the way down since Genesis, man, especially in college sports. And
Red Grange was getting money under the table, probably.
Well, I mean, undoubtedly, I've written about this in my book and on Extra Points. Yeah, there's been cheating since like 1907. Where I do see some potential reining in of that, though, is going to come from donor fatigue and donor interest once the school can pay some money. It's one thing if you're going to donors. Again, we'll use Nebraska as an example. We need to raise money to pay for athlete compensation because the school can't, and we need to have X amount of money to be competitive. And I don't know about Nebraska specifically, but across most of the Big Ten, what will generally happen is you'll have a group of people that are paying $10, $15 a month, like your small donors, and then you got 4 or 5 behemoths. And it's the behemoths that are really paying the football payroll, right? I think it becomes harder. If we imagine this next year, not to be political, but if it's a world here where maybe everyone's belts are having to tighten a little bit at home, and then the school says, or the collective says, would you like to donate? And the athletes on the Nebraska basketball team are making more money than you, which is a legitimate thing that will be the case, I think, for many families or ticket holders in the state. I think it gets harder to ask for money. So, I mean, maybe some of the Ameritrade people will still cut those checks, but I think that will diminish some of the donor money flowing in. Now, that's going to look different in different markets. The Alabama, Texas, Penn State football booster world is, I mean, like on some level, that's divorced from the free market. Or free market fundamentals, but I think you will see some of that. But there's going to be lawsuits. This is going to be challenged as an unfair restraint of trade. You don't have an antitrust exemption because there's no collective bargaining agreement. And I'll say this as somebody who really studies this professionally and has ADs reading and trying to trust what I say. I have no idea what the hell Congress is going to do. I don't know what the tax rate is today, what it might be in 2 days or a week from now. So maybe Ted Cruz comes to the NCAA's rescue. Maybe not. Like there's a lot of uncertainty, which I know makes it very difficult then for a coach or an AD to figure out how can I deploy these resources if I'm not entirely confident what the rules are going to be.
Yeah, it seemed to me like one of the big losers of the whole thing was Ted Cruz. I think they were really bashing on his proposed legislation on the hearing on Monday too. I mean, was there anything that's surprising that kind of came out of the hearing too? I know the 3 big discussion points were the phasing in of roster limits, the inclusion of future class members. And the judge really dismissed the Title IX concerns too. I know that was a major worry for a lot of people too. What were you, was there anything surprising to you that happened throughout the course of the hearing on Monday?
I don't think I was too surprised. That doesn't mean that, and that's again, just probably because I'm in the weeds on this stuff a lot, but I will say on the Title IX front or some of the other things, like Judge Wilkin, in my view, was pretty careful to say, my job here is to only consider antitrust law. And that's the basis that I'm using to say yay or nay about this. That doesn't mean that there aren't other legal challenges. If you, volleyball player in the audience here listening to this, think this is a Title IX violation, I invite you to bring a lawsuit. You may very well be right. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's not what I'm charged to make this decision about. Yeah. So there are potential legal issues independent of what we're talking about here that could threaten this, but it won't be decided in that particular courtroom.
Yeah. So I think the big winner, as always, lawyers.
That's what it is. The great irony, right? Like I thought I was going to be an attorney when I was starting my career, and I briefly worked in antitrust and thought, this is so boring. I can't possibly imagine doing document review in this world. I'm going to go jump into digital media. And man plans, God laughs. Here we are doing document review on antitrust for less money.
Matt, you had mentioned earlier that there are schools who have the option to opt out of this settlement and not be governed by these rules. Are you hearing any more about schools making that decision, or what? Is there a common thread between the schools that would make that decision? Just their size?
There is. Well, and the funny thing is, it isn't necessarily just about size or budget. So zooming out here for a second, one higher education issue. I don't know how much this is an issue specifically in Nebraska, but it is a big issue throughout the Midwest, is something called the enrollment cliff, which basically means, hey, this country's not making as many college-bound high school students as it used to.
It's an issue here. I can tell you that for sure.
Sure. I'm based in Illinois. Massive issue here. I grew up in Ohio. Big thing throughout the Northeast. It's not geographically concentrated. So that means, yeah, right. Every school or every school in this area is competing for a smaller number of potential students. And one thing that many schools do, both somewhat in Division I, but also in D2 and D3, is use sports as an enrollment strategy. Where they might say, we're going to have a baseball team, and we're going to have 8 scholarships. We might have 40 guys on the baseball roster. But so people who wouldn't have gone to my university otherwise will come and potentially pay half tuition or 3/4 tuition or maybe more because they want to play college baseball. And at some places, you might have 10, 15 or more % of your entire student body as athletes. And that's a very important business strategy to keep the school functioning. If you opt into the house settlement, maybe you can share some revenue directly. You probably don't have very much, but your rosters will shrink significantly, which means that you might lose hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in potential tuition. So a lot of the schools that you see opting out right now, some of them care very deeply about athletic success. And I'd point to the University of North Dakota and North Dakota State, who care a lot about basketball and hockey and football and lots of sports and are really good. And they're saying, we want to take a year to wait, in part because a ton of our students are from Minnesota. Our schools are under-enrolled. We have to be cognizant of this. You see this a lot with much smaller schools in the Northeast, in the NEC or the MAAC or places like that. But we'll also we'll see some schools that have $9 million athletic budgets that are going to opt in. The Utah Techs of the world, some HBCUs. It's not really just every school of this size will opt in or opt out. There's some local political issues that play too, and a lot of that has to do with enrollment.
We've seen a lot of, suing the NCAA is also not a novel approach. There's been some big lawsuits going back to the 80s with the Board of Regents lawsuit, O'Bannon, Alston. I know this is a settlement more so than an actual judge decision too. But are we going to be referring to the House settlement for whatever the near future for college athletics? Is this a turning point, an inflection point for how college athletics operates?
I definitely think it is. Even if this settlement is no longer in place in 5 years due to other legal challenges or athlete employment classification or a super league sponsored by the Saudi investment fund and BlackRock, who knows about any of that stuff, right?
Don't speak it into existence.
No, I'm sorry I said that. But it is something that I think has dramatically shifted kind of the Overton window or the sense of possibility with how college sports professionalizes or engages with some of this stuff. Here in the Big Ten, even 5-6 years ago, if we had asked ADs or presidents, hey, would you be comfortable operating a world where you are directly cutting $20 million in checks to athletes, some of whom who will be making north of $1 million a year? And I think a lot of people would have said, of course not. We'll go to Division III if that happens. That's against our values. We're not comfortable with it. Our boosters won't support it. And here we are. And I think come fall weekends, we're all still going to be really invested in college sports. And I think that once the people understand that the world doesn't collapse if you cut a young lady or a young man a check to play sports. And in fact, by a measure of control away from the auto dealers and the boosters of the world, that I think people will become more comfortable with that as we kind of build whatever college sports ends up looking like in the future.
Are we on? We joked about it a little bit too, but is college athletics on the verge of becoming just a playground for the wealthy too? You look at what happened to European soccer, and that's become a petro state. Whatever these Middle Eastern states that have all the oil money are just buying soccer clubs and getting their. There's a lot of sports washing going on there too. But you look at, the wealthy. What T. Boone Pickens has been doing this for a long time at Oklahoma State, and Phil Knight maybe to a degree at Oregon too.
Sure.
And is the House settlement, is that going to decrease it or just amplify it now, because now we have the schools contributing to it and the donors will be able to come up over the top of that?
Well, I think what you're describing is part of a trend that involves college athletics and also involves things outside of college athletics. I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but if I was to think specifically about women's volleyball, on one hand, you could look and say there's some amazing things happening at this sport at the college level. It's on linear television more than ever. more schools are starting to realize what you guys in Wisconsin have known for a long time, that it's fun as hell to go in person and you could build a really great in-arena experience. I've said this to so many ADs, like one of the coolest things I've done in my career was cover a volleyball game in Lincoln, which felt like a Taylor Swift concert. It's just it was just thousands of 10-year-old girls losing their minds. It's awesome. But I think we also understand, I'm sure you two in particular, I'm sure would understand, club volleyball is really expensive.
Oh, yeah.
And you might have the size and the talent and inclination, but you may not be able to afford the training and the coaching necessary to compete at this level. And there's probably not a whole lot of Pell Grant families that are playing Big Ten volleyball at this point, especially if schools can continue to recruit among wealthy families internationally to bring in some of those. It's a major problem in soccer and swimming and lacrosse and other places right now. You know, where I am in Chicago, in a more mixed income area, we don't even have like elementary school volleyball. I would have to go closer to Northwestern, you know, and leave my neighborhood to find some of those opportunities. And I think if that trend continues, regardless of what happens with House, we could say college volleyball might be becoming a playground for the rich, because you got to make six figures as a family to do the travel ball and do the tournaments and do to participate. And I think that would be a shame. It'd be a shame for the quality of the game and who gets to participate. So I worry about that, and I would also, you know, worry about the level of control that a handful of very rich people might have. And I think European soccer is instructive, because I think, you know, a question I get asked all the time is like, that surely all of this isn't sustainable, right? We can't just keep driving salaries up and up and up. Eventually, it won't be profitable anymore. And I would say, you know, maybe, but that's what happened in high-level European soccer. And a lot of those guys, those teams don't make money. They're EPL teams that lose money. You make the money when you sell the team and it becomes liquid, and you just sell it to a richer guy. And you just kind of move up. And now who owns elite programs in England and Spain and France? Russian oligarchs, Saudi oil petrostates, right? Like shady Bond villain characters, a couple of private equity fund managers in America. And that kind of level. We're not there in college football. You can have automotive dealership money and still be very involved. But maybe that changes in 20 years when the professional investors come in here.
Well, you know, we know that budgets are moral documents, right? It's like, show me your budget and I will show you what is important to you. And so most of the talk about revenue sharing is how it's going to affect sort of the big money-making sports in college athletics. That's football, that's men's basketball. But then what it's going to force all schools to do is prioritize their other sports based on revenue sharing, or you know, what colloquially is called revenue sharing, even if that's not an entirely accurate way to describe it. When you're talking with administrators and athletic directors, do they feel like they are going to be able to create a competitive advantage in sports like volleyball, like wrestling at Penn State, like baseball in the SEC, by prioritizing that in their revenue sharing budgets and knowing that a lot of the other schools across the country are just not going to invest in it at that level?
Unquestionably. So this is that been informally happening for a while before revenue sharing. What we call it would be tiering, where an athletic department would say, like, we're going to sponsor X number of sports, but we're really going to care about a Y number of sports, right? Who gets an operations manager, who has to ride the bus, that kind of thing. And I think the House era is making that thought process more explicit. And I'll give a couple of examples. One that I pointed to a couple of times would be in the Big West, which are schools that do not sponsor football. It's a mid-major basketball league. Was pretty solid for men's basketball at the top this year. You know, UC San Diego won, 25 games, I think, or more. But historically, it's been known for success in men's volleyball and in baseball, where teams like Long Beach and Cal State Fullerton and UC Santa Barbara have hosted regionals and can compete for national championships at that level. Maybe not quite the same way they did 15 years ago, but still very strong. You compare that to the Big Ten, where outside of the new Western schools and a little bit Nebraska, most schools here do not care. And you understand, because it's 30 degrees now, and you're going to get one good home weekend a year. So if you're the Big West, you might put more of your limited amount of money into baseball, and you might have more resources than Penn State does. I think another example, maybe to bring this more locally, and I say this as like a thought exercise, not because I've talked to Chris at Wisconsin about this specifically, but let's say you have your UW-Madison. You know you're going to have to spend a vast majority of your total money on football. Football is the revenue driver. You've got 85, 105 guys on that team, so you have to put more money there. the typical formula that people start when they're breaking down how they're going to spend is 75 football, 15% men's hoops, 5% women's hoops, 5% everything else. But let's say you're Wisconsin and you have a dynamite women's volleyball program. Competes for national championships, fills the Kohl Center, gets on national television. Very, very good. You're the defending national champs of women's hockey. Mm-hmm. Your women's basketball team is now in a very difficult conference, and no disrespect to our brethren in Madison, has mostly sucked. Do you decide to take half of that women's basketball money, or more than half of that, and kick it to volleyball and hockey, where you can have a greater, that money will go further and you can compete more for championships? If you're at the University of South Carolina, wouldn't you want to give every dollar you possibly can to Dawn Staley and say, forget volleyball? Like, especially because you've got 10 other teams in the SEC who might make postseason tournaments and are awesome. Just like, this is a lost cause. Ladies, go out there, make memories, get plenty of exercise, make friends, enjoy your scholarship at USC, but we're not going to give you a dime because Dawn needs it. As cynical as that sounds, I think that makes sense. And so I think in the Big Ten particularly, where there's a much larger portfolio of sports, whether it's investment in volleyball or wrestling, where a school like Iowa or Penn State, I think, will have to make at least a high six-figure commitment to function. Those are questions worth having. And I think the other kind of interesting thing, maybe Nebraska more so than maybe anybody else, is, can I afford to spend a little bit less because the women on my team are legitimately famous and will be able to offset that with actual marketing dollars over the cap in a way that they might not be able to get at any other program in the country?
Well, and that's what I was thinking with sort of my skepticism about the clearinghouse is, like, do you end up having rev share sports and NIL sports where you go and you tell your women's basketball team at UConn or South Carolina, like, hey, we're not going to give you money from rev share, but we're going to take care of you on the NIL side, and don't worry about the red tape. We'll get that figured out. And, like, at the end of the day, the money's going to be in your bank account. Who cares what label it comes in under? So that there are some schools that have both the revenue sharing and the boosters to support it, can sort of have their cake and eat it too.
And I would say maybe, like what you're describing, I'm aware of some coaches telling that to recruits, particularly on the women's basketball side right now. And they might say, we only have $500,000 in rev share, but we're gonna structure a licensing deal with our collective, or we're gonna do X, Y, or Z, so you'll still get 210 annually a year. Will that be permitted? Maybe, maybe not. Are those two things equivalent from a tax perspective? Maybe, maybe not. And depending on what we're hearing now, like with potential scholarships getting tax exposure, that could change things significantly. The unfortunate answer is that there are a lot of unknowns. And what you're describing is one tool that some schools and some markets will try and maybe be able to execute to keep everybody happy. I would think at a place like here, you wouldn't have to rely on donors as much because there is actual marketability. And I think anybody who's getting rotational minutes for Nebraska volleyball, all they wanted to do were volleyball camps, could make 5 figures a summer doing that sort of thing. But we'll see.
Yeah, we've mentioned the clearinghouse a couple of times too. And that is supposed to be a database run by was it Deloitte?
Yep, Deloitte.
Over $600. So if they have a deal over $600, they have to officially register. And I think that's kind of designed to help with we're just going to pay you whatever with no fair market value. It's kind of what you're asking for is that what you're supposed to be getting through advertisement. And I still think there's a lot of leeway with that as far as, the starting setter for Nebraska versus someone else who's a anonymous, I don't know, reserve women's backup point guard. I don't know. Just is there still a lot of leeway available within that database too, or is that just so people say that they're doing something to help rein in the NIL?
So this is probably the single biggest black box of what's happening here. And the way it's been described to me is that the purpose of this clearinghouse is not to say, couldn't help but notice you got $1,000 to sign an autograph, but fair market value says it should only be $891. So you're going to NCAA jail. Like, that's probably not what anybody really wants to be doing. There is a lot of pressure from schools to have something that would make it harder for institutions to evade the salary cap, right? If you are a left tackle at USC, you've got 90 Instagram followers, and you are not a personable speaker, and you're a third, a second day NFL draft pick kind of person, you're probably not marketable at all. And if somebody pays you $100,000 to sign autographs, that is a way to say your left tackle skills are worth $100,000 to us. Mm-hmm. And what the settlement wants to say is like, if that's true, pay them with your house money. If you want to go get extra money, you have to do it in a way that lines up with what somebody of similar metrics in a similar market might make. And I have to think that you'd have to be an order of magnitude off before a clearinghouse would come in and flag something. We don't know if once that happens, if there'll be a lawsuit. I mean, there will be a lawsuit, but if it'll hold up in court, because this is a settlement that's now been blessed by a federal judge. So it has a little bit more legal authority than NCAA mall cops did 8 years ago. But I felt as if I could predict the future of the legal system or the political system, my newsletter would cost more than $9. Like that's something that's above my pay grade.
Great value.
We're with Matt Brown of Extra Points, and Matt, you not only has NIL and now rev sharing just changed the economics on the athletic side for players, we've also seen a big change in athletic administrations over the last couple of years. You have new hires who are being hired in general manager positions, or more accountants being hired by athletic departments to kind of work this all out. At the end of the day, have you been able to see, is there a common thread in who are going to make these financial allocation decisions? Is it going to be athletic directors who maybe don't have this kind of background, or are they going to kick this over to a general manager position or a director of compliance? Who's kind of going to end up setting the formula, or is it going to be different at each school?
A lot of this is going to be very different from each school. When we're talking about big budgets for football, generally, these decisions are going to be made in some kind of consultation between the head football coach, a general manager, / a director of player personnel or recruiting coach or an operations person on that end. And I don't think every school is going to hire a GM, because the way the organizational structures are set up are different from school to school. I know Nebraska has, and several other programs have. What I can tell you is, like, the people who are GMs right now tend to come from two different camps. And this is true, I think, on the football and the men's basketball side. They either tend to come from folks that have spent a long time in player personnel, working in college recruitment areas and working around coaches, and understand how to evaluate tape and how to build relationships across campus, and they're college sports guys. But then you have a group of people that come primarily from professional sport front offices and the folks that are used to trying to find holes in collective bargaining agreements and be capologists and that sort of thing. And I don't necessarily know if one is better than the other, but I do know that there are some very significant differences between the NFL and college football right now. Particularly, NFL's got a CBA, so you've got rules. College doesn't. NFL, we know how much everybody makes because that's public. In college, it's not. Most people are making stuff up, and despite my best efforts to toy with things, you're going to get very little in that way. In college, most people are working from the same standardized data sets. In college, they're not. So is the assistant GM of the Chicago Bears going to be the best guy to go help Georgia Tech figure out how to spend their money? Maybe, maybe not. You'll know say. You're like, we'll find out in a little bit. I tend to think that the people who are most confident that they know exactly how it's going to be are usually selling some kind of software.
Yeah, that's great. We'll get you out on this one too. I mean, the House settlement will get finalized hopefully sometime this spring too, but it won't be the end of litigation. Is there one thread or one kind of area you feel that there's still going to be a lot of litigation that can change the landscape, or what's one area to keep watching as college athletics starts to evolve as more and more lawsuits pile up?
Yeah, I know that this is generally not the sort of thing that people want to talk about when they're talking about sports. Like the people out there, they're like, I watch volleyball, so I never have to hear the word Senate Majority Leader. Like, brother, I get it, man. But like that, I think that's the major issue. We have collective bargaining agreements in pro sports that are exempt from antitrust law because they were collectively bargained between a union that represents employees and management. And that's true whether it's pro basketball or the UAW or something else, right? We can't do that in college because right now the athletes aren't employees. They don't have a union. They, in many places, legally can't create a union, and they're really not even organized. The athlete advocacy organizations right now have membership that is a tiny, tiny percentage of current athletes. More of them have ex-athletes in them more than they do current athletes, which I also get. because I don't know about you gentlemen, even as a pretty politically active, more bookish 20-year-old, I was way more interested in girls and playing Metal Gear Solid than I was about like labor solidarity or what my earning potential might have been like 10 years later. Like that's not age appropriate behavior, right? So you're going to see other lawsuits, I think, about the role that player agency has in caps on how money is distributed or how it's reported, or conflicts between state laws and federal law. And there probably does need to be some kind of national bill to either provide a mechanism for athletes to be involved in those decisions, or to shut them all down completely and forever and say, it doesn't matter. You're not employees. You're never going to be employees. This is an extracurricular activity. These are the rules and you like it. The NCAA has been trying to get a bill like that for a couple of years. They're trying now, and it might be a little bit easier now that Republicans control everything in Washington. But as a bunch of other things are going on right now that have captured lawmaker attention beyond college basketball. So whether that actually happens, open question. But there'll be lawsuits until it's resolved.
Well, isn't that kind of where we're eventually heading? Or like one of the easiest ways to get two sides to a negotiating table is you have to have a second side. I know that in college administrators and university presidents and politicians don't want to give a bunch of young people, particularly a bunch of young people of color, a bunch of bargaining power. But don't you have to create some sort of organized side so that you can make an agreement with? And I would push back on you just a little bit. I mean, I have a little bit of an organizing background too, and we're seeing this with Starbucks baristas across the country unionizing and closing down shops. If you tell people this, it affects their income, for the next 10, 5-6 years of their life, like they're going to get real passionate about, learning the history of the Wobblies and all the other lefty stuff that, you're indoctrinated with as a union representative.
No, and I think that's a good point. I would say you're right, but there's also a reason why we haven't historically seen terribly strong unions in places like Starbucks or McDonald's or Burger King, even though those workers would probably benefit from that in some way, in part because they tend to be really transient. And in places like higher education or K-12 education or firefighters, where you don't have to reorganize every 18 months because people have been stewards for a while and can build that culture. It can be a little bit easier. I have done union organizing in my life too. I helped organize the union of Vox before I left, and like that honestly really stuck with me because that was a pretty small unit. It's like 160 people, and it was hard. And it worked because of a lot of interpersonal relationship building, not stuff that came from like the writers union from New York. And ultimately, I think that probably is what has to happen with college, is that we might have a bunch of really well-meaning reporters or economists or activists or suits, and who could lay out a very convincing reason why you need to band together. But if it doesn't happen from the athletes themselves, talking to athletes themselves in their dorms and apartments, it's going to be very difficult to stick. And maybe that does happen someday, but you can't force it to happen. If management creates a union, brother, that's not going to be a very strong union, right? Like, and that's, ironically, I think the NCAA would probably benefit from having a union right now to negotiate with for some of these things, because I think they'd kick that union's ass. And part of why I have been less effusive in like demanding that is the best way to go forward for athletes, is I look at that and think, if you don't have the organization behind it, you don't want to go to that table, because then you might end up with fewer scholarships than you had before. And they're difficult questions. I legitimately don't know the best way forward for other things, and I feel uncomfortable as a guy who has a lot less to lose than the libero for Creighton, for any of these things, that I should say what she should do one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, and again, hopefully the first thing that will happen is we'll get a settlement for House verdict next week or two, and that. But really enjoyed the conversation, Matt. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed the stuff, which you're sicko like me, or if you just have an interest in
and me,
it's definitely worth the subscription. extrapointsmb.com is where you go. You can follow Matt on Twitter at Matt Brown EP. We didn't even get to talk about my passion of conference realignment: Utah Valley State, Sacramento State. Sorry, St. Francis, PA, you're shutting down athletics. So covers.
They're not. No, they're joining Division III, and they're joining the league.
Right.
The league
right.
That is a partner of the Extra Points Bowl. So in a year or two, when their reclassification is finished, maybe St. Francis plays in my bowl game.
That, or if you just you also like covering the EA Sports franchise too. I know you get a lot of information about that. So Matt Brown, one of the leading writers in the college business world too. It's been a pleasure to have you on Volleyball State. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, guys.